Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel for another how-to video. This time on the bench we have the 1/72nd scale BAE Harrier GR.9A gift set. Because this is a gift set, the kit inside is not one of the starter sets with the reduced parts count, but rather it's a full-blown Airfix kit that comes packaged with some poly cement, some paintbrushes and some Humbrol acrylic paints to paint the finished model. The skill level on this particular kit is a number 2, which is slightly higher than the starter sets as it does represent a bit more of an in-depth project and slightly more of a challenge. On the back of the box you'll find the usual full colour diagrams with the colour callouts for the supplied acrylic paints. These are referenced on the diagrams with small arrows indicating the different parts of the aircraft and what colour they need to be. In the small rectangular boxes you'll find numbers which relate to the marking sheet supplied with the kit, and these will aid in placement. Inside the box there's a large bag containing all of the model kit's parts, and there's a smaller bag inside here containing the clear parts for the cockpit and a few other details. A smaller bag contains the poly cement and the Humbrol acrylic paints, and with this gift set you get 2 paintbrushes, a size 4 and a size 0. The size 4 brush is slightly larger to assist with painting larger areas on the kit, and the 0 is smaller for detail painting. The supplied transfer sheet contains all of the aircraft's markings, and placement is shown on the back of the box on the colour diagrams. There's a full instruction manual provided which details the entire build, and it's important that you read this carefully as there are several options for different variants for this model kit that you need to choose from as you build. All of the model kit's parts come supplied on these moulded frames. This is part of the injection moulding process and also assists in keeping everything organised. Each frame has a large moulded tab which gives you the frame's letter, and next to each part there's a smaller tab which is moulded with the individual part numbers. These part number and frame letter are combined into the callouts in the circles in the instructions. To build the model we'll be using our usual pair of cutters for cutting parts from the frame, followed by our modelling knife to cut away any excess plastic and also scrape away any mould seams. The file will be used to file away any plastic left behind by the frame connection points to ensure a proper fit, and then we'll be using a pair of tweezers just to assist with applying the markings. All in all, a very basic set of easily accessible model tools. Before we begin our build, we're going to paint the frames using Humbrol's acrylic spray primer. This will give the parts a nice matte finish ready to take paint later on in the project, but it's important that we work in a safe manner and follow all of the warnings and instructions on the back of the can to ensure that we don't put our health in danger. All of the parts have been washed in warm soapy water, and we've got some cardboard down to protect the bench. So we're going to give the acrylic primer a good shake and then test the spray pattern out to ensure that the can is spraying smoothly. We can then go ahead and start applying light coats of the primer in a left to right motion, turning the frames around to make sure that we hit all of the different areas on all of the parts attached to the frames. This process can then be repeated for each individual frame, making sure that the whole surface is covered, and we're left with a wonderful smooth surface that will take the acrylic paints supplied with the kit far easier than trying to brush paint onto the bare plastic. This prevents any surface tension issues and allows us to cover the model with fewer coats, which means we can achieve a smoother finish with the acrylic paint. Step 1 of the build involves the ejector seat, which is 2 different colours, so we're going to paint the parts while they're still attached to the frame and then glue them together afterwards. We'll start with number 33, which is matte black, and after opening the paint we'll give it a quick stir just to undo any separation that may have occurred while the kit was in storage. Once the paint's been stirred, we can transfer a small amount into our palette using the paintbrush, and then we'll dilute this paint with about 30% ordinary tap water. This additional water mixed in with the paint will prolong the drying time, allowing the paint to self-level on the surface of the model. This will result in a smoother finish, but it does mean that we have to build up coverage with a couple of thin layers. Once the paint is prepared, we can start applying the first layer of matte black to the sides of the ejector seat. While that black paint is drying, we can move ahead and paint the ejector seat cushion with number 155 olive green. You can see that this has separated way worse than the black paint while the kit was being stored, but a 30-second stir has returned the paint to its normal consistency, and we can transfer it into the palette and, just as before, dilute it with about 30% tap water. This can then be painted onto the ejector seat's cushions, and we can move on to cover some other parts which are involved in the early stages of the build, so they're ready to use. We can now go back to the sides of our ejector seat and add the second coat of number 33 matte black, just to solidify the colour in those areas, and then do the same on all the rest of the parts which we're going to need through the stages in the first couple of pages of the instructions. We can now remove the ejector seat parts from the frames, using the cutters to make the initial cuts well away from the surface of the model components. We can then switch to the modelling knife to make the final, more precise cuts nearer the surface, and this avoids the large blades from the cutters damaging any of the model detail. We'll then switch to the file to remove any final traces of the connection points, before touching in these areas of bare plastic with a little bit of the paint left over in the palette. The seat cushion can then be removed from the frames in exactly the same way, with the initial cuts made using the cutters, before being cleaned up with the knife and finally the file, and then the bare plastic touched in with the olive green paint number 155. Once the cockpit tub had been removed from the frame and its connection points cleaned up, there was one additional step to do before we could proceed, and that's to paint the raised instrument detail either side of the pilot using some number 33 matte black. To do this, we use the number 0 brush supplied with the kit, which is the smaller of the two brushes, and we just loaded the paint onto the brush and then used the tip and the very side of the brush to catch these raised details, making sure that they were painted all the way around. Once this was done on both sides, we left it to dry and we can carry on with the first stages of the actual build. We're going to be using the polycement supplied with the kit, which is a type of glue that works by melting plastic together, so it isn't a standard adhesive, and it's supplied in a metal tube with quite a broad nozzle, which can make it quite difficult to control, particularly if you're a newer modeller. In order to get better control over the glue, what we like to do is apply it to the model using some scrap bits of card which we can cut away from the kit's box. By cutting the top corner of the gift set box away using our modelling knife, we're left with an applicator that can be used to precisely add the glue to the model kit. We can then cut one of the flaps from the kit box and use this as a pallet where we can deposit the polycement and then transfer the glue to the model kit more accurately. This gives us far more control over where the glue is going and means we're less likely to get excess glue on the surface causing damage. After applying some polycement to the pallet, we can then use the applicator to apply the polycement along the edges of the seat cushion before pushing the side of the ejector seat onto that part and allowing the glue to take hold. Once that was in position on both sides, we can apply some polycement onto the locating peg inside the cockpit tub and then push the ejector seat into position. We'll hold it for a few seconds just while the polycement does its work and then set it aside to cure fully, allowing the two surfaces of the plastic to form a permanent join. While we're waiting for that glue to dry, we moved ahead and painted the inside of the undercarriage wells with white paint, as we're going to build this model with the undercarriage down, so these areas will be visible. Because we painted all of the initial parts we required while they were still attached to the frame, we can now complete the cockpit by gluing in the control stick and then finally the instrument panel, as they're all pre-painted and ready to go. Once all of these parts are glued into place and the glue has been allowed to cure, the cockpit is completed and we can start thinking about enclosing the cockpit in the nose of the aircraft. The two halves of the nose are removed from the frame using the same process that we showed before, starting with the cutters, followed by the knife and finally the file to ensure that all excess plastic is removed. We can then start a process which is known as dry fitting, where the fit of the parts is tested without any glue to ensure that all of the excess plastic from the connection points and any mould seams have all been removed and there's no extra plastic interfering with the fit of the components. You can see that the two halves of the nose fit together and there are no gaps, so we know we're good to proceed. We can then apply polycement in all of the areas where the cockpit assembly meets with the wall of the nose of the aircraft. We can then push the cockpit assembly into position and hold it firmly for a few seconds while the polycement does its job. We're going to be deploying some tactical clothes pegs straight from the washing line to assist us in holding the two halves of the nose assembly together while the glue dries. We'll start by applying the polycement along this join, concentrating the glue towards the inside of the model pieces so that any excess glue will squeeze out towards the inside of the model rather than out onto the visible surface. Once the polycement has been added to all the relevant areas, the second half of the nose can be pushed into position, and then we can close this up with our hands first and then follow that up by putting some clothes pegs on in key areas just to keep the two halves together while the glue bites in and does its thing. Once that glue is dry, you can see we've got a nice neat closure between the two halves and there's no excess glue visible anywhere. We can give this join a quick file just to remove any areas which may be standing slightly proud and make sure that the joins are seamless once the paint goes on. After painting the intakes with a couple of coats of number 34 white, the whole nose assembly was put aside and we worked on the fuselage. The two halves were removed and cleaned up in the same fashion that we showed earlier, and the assemblies for the rear undercarriage and air brake were removed from the frame, assembled and painted with white as we wanted to model them open. Polycement was added to the locating tabs on the inside of one of the fuselage halves, and then these sub-assemblies glued into position. Once they were in place, the compressor fan, which we'd painted already, was glued onto the intakes, which again we'd already painted white, and then this was glued onto one of the fuselage halves as well, ready for us to complete the final closure of this part of the build. The polycement was concentrated along the inside face of this join, again just to make sure that no excess glue squeezed out onto the visible surface of the model, and then the two halves of the fuselage were closed first by hand, followed by the application of some clothes pegs just to hold everything together while the glue dried. With the fuselage glued together, we added all of the parts for the vertical takeoff and landing system. The nozzles on our model were glued facing towards the rear of the aircraft, but of course you do have the option to model these facing towards the ground. Once those were in position, we moved our attention to the rear of the aircraft and glued in the horizontal stabilizer. After adding a little bit of polycement to the mounting points, we then glued in the rear tail boom, which traps the whole assembly in place. Before the glue had had time to fully harden, we were able to adjust the horizontal stabilizer and get it into the correct position before the glue dried. Moving on to assembling the wings, we carried out extensive dry fitting and removed a little bit of excess plastic to ensure that the fit on these parts was perfect before we glued them into place. Once everything looked good and there were no visible gaps, we added the polycement, again concentrating it towards the inside of the model, and then pushed the wing assembly into position, forcing the glue to go down into the model rather than out onto the visible areas. After holding for a few seconds, we moved our attention slightly forward and glued in the rest of the top of the fuselage. We then settled very quickly into a rhythm, completing the majority of the build and adding the pylons to the underside of the wings and the control surfaces. The build was progressing very well at this point, and we moved our attention then to the undercarriage, which we painted while it was still attached to the frame. Each part was given 2 coats of number 34 white paint, and then we progressed on towards the tyres, which were touched in with number 33 matte black. These were carefully painted right up to the edge of the moulded tyre detail, taking great care not to get any of the black paint on the areas which we'd just painted white. Before we could progress any further, we had to finish off the detailing of the fuselage by cutting away a sliver of card from our applicator, small enough to get the polycement into the locating holes for the tiny details. These were the last things that we needed to add before we could paint the main body of the aircraft and then add the undercarriage before progressing to the final stages. Once all of the tiny details were added, we diluted some of the number 165 grey paint supplied with the kit with the usual 30% tap water, and then using the larger number 4 brush supplied with the model, we started to apply the initial coat of this paint. Because the model has been primed, application was really straightforward, and we focused on getting good coverage as evenly as possible and painting carefully up to any areas that we'd already painted with the number 34 white. Once the initial coat of paint was completely dry, another coat of the number 165C grey was added over the top to solidify the colour coverage. The additional tap water will ensure that it dries nice and smooth without any brush marks in the paint, so we concentrated on ensuring all areas were covered and there was no streakiness or primer left showing through. The next step was to paint the vertical takeoff and landing nozzles with a black base coat using number 33. This black base coat was the starting point for the number 11 silver paint, and the black helps it to be a bit more shiny and give it a bit more of a brighter finish. The rear nozzles needed to be painted with a slightly darker mixture, which was created using number 11 and number 33 mixed together. With the fuselage painted, the undercarriage components were then removed from the frame as shown earlier, and then touched up with white paint to make sure there was no bare plastic left showing. Because these parts are small and fragile, they were removed from the frame directly with the modelling knife rather than using the cutters. Once everything had been removed, cleaned up and then touched up with its relevant colours, everything was set aside to dry completely, and then we can start the assembly process for the undercarriage. The small piece of applicator that we cut away from our main one was used to guide the polycement into the relevant areas, and then the undercarriage parts guided into place. The tweezers were used to firmly press the undercarriage into position, making sure that the locating pegs were all firmly seated, and then the last wheels were added on the outside of each wing using a very small amount of polycement just to make sure it didn't bubble out onto the visible surface of the model when these parts were pressed into place. The whole model was then flipped and then checked for alignment by making sure that the model doesn't rock when you put pressure on it. The final step for the undercarriage was to add the doors to each of the landing gear bays using a tiny drop of polycement on each peg before guiding the parts into place using the tweezers and then pushing the ends firmly to make sure they're seated properly and that everything lines up. Once all of the landing gear doors were added, these then had to be painted with some of the number 165C grey to make sure that their finish matches the exterior of the rest of the model. With the majority of the fuselage now complete, we just needed to add the clear details. The clear frame was removed from its bag and the cockpit canopy parts snipped with the cutters well away from the finished model parts surface. The modelling knife was then used to carefully trim away any excess plastic, and then finally the file used to remove any evidence of the connection points. Once this was complete, the canopy's frame needed to be carefully picked out using the number 165C grey to match the rest of the body. We used the size 0 brush for this, using the point of the brush and the sides of the bristles to just carefully pick out the raised detail of the canopy's frame. Once this was completely dry, there are two parts to the rear portion of the canopy, one of which has already been painted with number 165, so small dots of polycement were added and these two parts glued together. There are a couple of other small clear parts which needed to be glued into place, and we did this first before adding tiny dots of polycement around the mounting point for the front canopy and guiding this part into place very carefully, making sure not to get any glue on any of the clear surfaces. The rear canopy can be posed open or closed, and we chose to pose it open, so added a few dots of polycement halfway up the edge of the cockpit before finally gluing the second half of the canopy into place and completing the actual physical build of this model kit. The only thing left to do now is to add the markings. Now these markings don't work like stickers, and instead each marking has to be individually cut from the sheet and then immersed in tap water and left for a few minutes to soak. This will make the marking slide free of its backing paper. When the marking is ready to apply, it will move freely under gentle pressure from a paintbrush, and the surface can be prepared with just a little bit of tap water before the marking is slid into position on the surface of the model. The additional tap water that was added before the transfer will allow for repositioning, so you can get it into the perfect place before you either allow it to dry naturally or dab it with some tissue to lock the transfers in place. We used the detailed diagrams on the back of the box to add all of the markings, and then moved on to the final step, which was to add the fuel tanks and the optional weapons loadout underneath the wings on all of the pylons. All of these parts were assembled and painted using the techniques that we already showed in the video, and they were simply given a dab of polycement and then pushed into the locating tabs on each pylon before being allowed to dry. And that completes the assembly and painting of the Airfix BAE Harrier GR.9A gift set. If you've watched any of our videos, you'll know that we usually build the starter set range in the how-to series. However, the gift set range offers a little bit of a step up from that, providing a more complicated project that's a bit more involved and requires a bit more experience. If you're someone who's got a few starter sets under your belt already, this could well be the perfect way to up your game and get into building more complex model kits. If you're someone that's potentially been in the hobby for a while and maybe moved away, the convenience of having all the colours in one box saves all that time perusing the paint shelf at the model shop just to make sure you've got all of the correct colours in stock. Either way, we're very happy with the way this gift set turned out, using only the contents of the box and a few basic tools, and we hope that you'll give it a try at home as well. So thank you very much for joining us for some modelling today, and as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.